Father Lomnitzer.
Hello, Charles. How are
How are
you?
you?
I'm great. How are you?
Living the dream. So now, as a kid, did you ever play a card game where you each take half a deck and you take the top card over, and then the other person takes the top card over, and whoever has the higher card wins?
You mean war?
Oh, yes. I guess that's what they call it, because that's a good segue to our topic today. Is we're talking about war and just war, nothing else.
Not the card
So
game. I did play the card game. I was very good at it.
you were you were very good. There is no strategy.
I'm very
How
good
could
at
you be good
I'm
at
very
it?
good at games of chance.
You're very good. Fortune smiles on you, Father Lomnitzer, is what you're saying. So,
Fortune
yes,
favors the
yeah.
bold.
Well, that's it does, and you are certainly bold, if nothing else. So, yes, but we're here to talk about just war. So, the U.S. is currently at war as of the recording of this here on the whatever
The
today's date
10th.
is. So the 10th, the afternoon of the 10th, so of April. So things may change between when we record this and when this episode goes live. So please bear with us. But we're really not looking to discuss too much about the specific Iran situation, other than obviously we hope for a lasting and just peace to the situation. And there's a ceasefire and other things, but it's a moving target, so to speak, or a evolving situation, right, Father? And so I think for the sake of what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the principles of just war, given that everyone here is talking about war, and we'll let you, the listener, decide how to apply that and interpret that. But we're not going to really directly go into Iran. Is that right, Father? Well, we're not going to Iran because it's 1,000 miles away, but that's
No, yeah. I think the idea here is we want to. The theory, just war theory, has been thrown out a lot by Catholic bishops, by non-Catholics, by Catholic commentators. It's kind of just out there. So I think just do a deep dive into what just war theory actually is, maybe lend to some examples in history. And then we believe in the intelligence of our listeners. And so you also can draw your own conclusions. We're not here to tell you what to think, but to create the framework and to explain the framework of what the church thinks. And yeah, as this plays out, more information about the motivations, the goals, the successes. It's the question. I think it's hard to determine whether or not a war can be just when you're in the middle of it, which is difficult. But there is things that you have to consider when declaring or entering into a war. And I thought one commentator said too, right? Like, we don't have all the information as the body of America, because as numerous presidents have said, but this one especially, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense to talk about your plan to go to war, because that gives away the element of surprise. So I don't think we have all the information. Not that it's being withheld from us maliciously, but strategically. That's the best hope. And so I think, yeah, just dive into the theory and see what conclusions people draw from.
Exactly. And yeah, we'll be able to talk about historical events, and we'll be able to opine, obviously having the benefit of hindsight. But we're in the fog of war, literally. Not like we're not in the fog, but I mean, you've heard that figure of speech, right, Father? Right? Like,
Well, that was the bad use of the word literally then.
Literally. Well, we're literally, because there's the fog of war, because like war's going on. We don't know what's going on all the time and all the nuances. We don't have the classified briefings. We don't, we're seeing news stories and things. So yes, but at least in terms of the church, because Jesus tells us, our blessed Lord, in the Gospels to turn the other cheek, right? When your enemies strike you, offer him your other cheek, right? And so it was quite interesting, because I think early Christians were pacifists, right? Father Lomnitzer, is that more or less?
I don't know if pacifism was ever actually a staunch hold Catholic belief, but I think this idea of limiting the amount of violence that takes place. I mean, and the commandments, right? Let's start in the Old Testament, right? Too, right? The commandments is not "thou shalt not kill" as it is commonly rendered. It's more understood in moral theology as "thou shalt not murder." And there's a distinction to be made between killing and murdering, and something that's been fleshed out over the history of time. This is, again, Newman's principle of organic development is not that doctrine changes, but that we have a better understanding and a better vocabulary to explain it and to understand it in the time, right? So it grows like an acorn into an oak tree, right? Everything is contained in what the oak tree needs to be in the acorn, but over time it expands and grows. So that's the understanding of doctrine. So the principle too in the Old Testament is a murder is always wrong, but that all human life is sacred. So the killing of someone is not something that we should take lightly. It's something that should be with the highest regard and taken most seriously. But there is a distinction between the types of killing that take place, right? Like the understanding of self-defense has always been around, right? That someone can kill someone and not be guilty of a sin. And we have this in the Old Testament in Exodus 15:3. God is described as a man of war, affirming that war under certain conditions is not always inherently evil, right? And then we see this in Joshua, David, the getting to the promised land, and in Maccabees, right? The fighting on every side, that war sometimes is necessary. And it's questionable as to why God permits like the wiping out of certain civilizations in the Old Testament. It's kind of one of like the harder parts of scripture to talk about. But that distinction, I think, needs to be at the forefront of people's minds. And this is why we make the distinction between combatants and civilians in war.
Yes, no, it's a good point. And so, because like in the Geneva Convention, they outline this very clearly that that soldiers have to be uniformed, identifiable. You can't dress as civilians and then do a surprise attack, right? At least I don't think you can. Again, I'm not an expert on the Geneva Conventions, but pretending to be one for at least the next 40 some minutes here. But yeah, and like you can't also like misuse like there's the Red Cross symbol, which is interesting because we think of it as like a first aid kit symbol, right? Like you have the red cross with like a white thing, but actually it's not only for first aid kits. It's meant for things that are protected under the Geneva Convention, because to make it very clear, because they realized that yes, uniforms are easy to distinguish soldiers, but how do you determine what's sort of out of bounds? And so you're not supposed to kill medics. You're not supposed to in war. And so that's why they would be marked with the Red Cross. And so we started associating that with medical things. But in theory, the Red Cross, which is protected under international law, it can be put on any sort of the protected civilian infrastructure with certain rules. But like you can't paint a helicopter with a Red Cross and then put guns on it and go blow up people, right? Like that would be a war crime. And then, but it's also interesting is that the Red Cross, it started I believe in Switzerland, so it's an inverse of their flag. But there's also the Red Crescent, which is in Middle Eastern countries because it has obviously a religious connotation. And there's the red, so sometimes you'll see the Red Cross and Red Crescent in terms of what they're recognizing. But yeah, it's the idea to distinguish. But I think also it's an important way to think that like, yeah, the cross, right, does protect us, right, in a way. It's almost like there's a practical, it's red and white, but also, distinguishing civilian casualty. And yeah, the church talks about, right. Well, Father Lamitzer, we don't want to jump too far into the principles of just war because I think we'll talk about what are the rules of proportionality and protecting civilian populations.
Well, yeah, when we can move to the New Testament and how does Jesus relate to soldiers? And, he was under Roman occupation and, that's a whole nother conversation. We could probably do like 4 or 5 episodes on the Roman Empire. But right, Jesus doesn't rebuke soldiers or tell them to, repent and leave military service. But actually, the centurion who talks to the Lord about authority, right? The Lord says, he praises his faith and doesn't tell him to abandon the role, right? Like stop being a soldier. But he says, your faith is strong, because he says, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Words that we repeat every day at Mass. And, but only say the word, and my servant shall be healed. And we take that and replace servant with soul. And the Lord praises him and says, go, your faith has saved you, right? Or your faith has healed your servant. So And then in the early church, we have great saints who are soldiers, right? The quintessential one who every child picks as their confirmation saint because he's the patron saint of athletes is Saint Sebastian, who was a Roman soldier, and didn't like depart from his duty because he was a Christian, but was murdered because he was a Christian. And so Saint Sebastian, and then you have Saint George, of course, the famous warrior English saint.
First North African, but
Sure.
the English kind of adopted him, right? He wasn't actually from England.
Yeah, and then Joan of Arc, which has a messy history, but a messy arc of her life, if you will, but ultimately canonized and a great icon in French history.
Yeah, and I think just to correct a pet peeve of mine, I didn't realize until I was in Rome this last time, is that Saint Sebastian was not killed by the arrows. And it wasn't like he was miraculously, like they shot him with the arrow. Well, it was miraculous. I guess they shot him with all the arrows. And I thought, oh, that's how he got it. Because you always see Saint Sebastian with a bunch of arrows sticking in him. But he survived, and then they cut off his head. So it's kind of like, just want to correct a little bit of fake news that I was believing. But yeah, no, there have been, lots of warrior saints. And Saint Martin of Tours, right, who was a Roman general in, I don't want to say the years because I'm going to get it wrong, but he was a saint and is revered. And I think didn't he become a bishop too? And then we have military chaplains right today. So Father Emil Capon, alumnus of the Catholic University of America and recipient of the Medal of Honor, who in the Korean War was a chaplain in the U.S. Army and was eventually taken as prisoner of war and ministered in the POW camp before ultimately dying there from starvation, or they were like doing terrible things. And there's obviously a recognition that war is I think a less desirable part of how the world works. It's probably not the thing you go to first when you have a choice. Like I always think back to my police cadet training. So for those of you who don't know, I had, a few glorious years where I learned some things about police. But the whole point is it's the use of force, right? So it doesn't say, you witness a crime, shoot them, right? It says you witness a crime, first, use escalate. So you try to talk, right? And then they use lethal force only as a last resort when there's threat of great bodily harm or life, to you or to others. And so recognizing, because that's kind of how the church teaches it, right? Father Laminster, we're supposed to start diplomatically. And I can tell you're trying not to laugh at me being a police cadet because you think that like I was running around with a whistle, like, writing little parking tickets or something, but it was more than that.
Stop in the name of the law. No, I always just related to Dwight Schrute. You are a volunteer sheriff's deputy. But it also reminds me of one of the things that one of our Swiss Guard friends told us when we asked if they carry weapons and do they ever have to use them. And he said 99% of conflicts that we face, we can settle with our words. And then you said, and the other 1%, you use the pointy stick.
Yes, the axe, they kill the halberd. So, which I don't think they use anymore. But yeah, no, it's a good point. And the church has an army, right? So there's, the Swiss Guards, right, which are a military force designed to protect the Pope. So, and they have weapons and things. So clearly there's a way that it can work within the Christian moral life, but it's very tightly monitored, as, much of Christian life is, right? There's ways that freedom can be abused, and certain things that are good in certain contexts aren't good in all contexts. And I think Thomas Aquinas, wasn't he the one who really, Augustine, a lot of Christians thinkers have tried to coalesce thoughts on this, but I think Aquinas, was he the most, he was always kind of the one who sort of sets the standard. He coalesces a lot of things, comes with some ideas.
Yeah. Augustine does talk about war and everything. And actually, Aquinas references Augustine a lot in his Summa Theologia. And so it's the second part of the second part in the Summa Theologia, question 40, article 1, where Aquinas asks the question whether it is always sinful to wage war. And he says, this is not true. And he quotes Augustine saying, if the Christian religion forbade war altogether, those who sought solitary advice in the gospel would rather have been counseled to cast aside their arms and to give up soldiering altogether. On the contrary, they were told, do violence to no man and be content with your pay. If he commanded them to be content with their pay, he did not forbid soldiering. So that's where Augustine kind of launches off. And so then Aquinas spells out 3 principles of what needs to take place in order for a war to be just. And so he says the first principle is, and he says 3 things are necessary, which means all 3 of these things need to be in place. So it's not just like one of the requirements have to be met. All principles of just war theory have to be met in order for a war to be considered justified. And so the first is the authority of the sovereign by whose command the war is to be waged. He says, for it is not the business of a private individual to declare war. So what we're talking about here is governments, sovereign nations, people within the proper authority, right? The Secretary of State can't declare war. I can't declare war. Unfortunately, I've tried.
You've tried. So yeah, but no, it's a good point, right? Because I think, I like the idea, like you get a motley crew together with, and go solve, attack another country or something. Like, yeah, that's obviously not to be desired. And so limiting it to sovereign states, it limits who can commit war. And that's where I think it really became a challenge after September 11th, right? Because Al-Qaeda was not a state. And so they didn't have, whatever the sovereignties, they didn't have embassies, they didn't have a head of state, have a government. They didn't obviously have a legislature. They controlled very sort of influenced parts of territory. It was a terrorist group, right? That was what they were. And so ISIS started to have the trappings of a state, right? But that came around later, where they started occupying certain territory and taxing citizens. And there's certain requirements of sovereignty. So a sovereign state is required to have, first, a permanent population, 2, a defined territory, a government not under the control of another, and the capacity to interact with other sovereign states. And it's a little bit like, I think that last logic is kind of tricky because it's like international recognition. Like, well, all the other sovereign states recognize all the other sovereign states, so that's what makes them sovereign states. It's like, well, okay. But yeah, I think it's an important one. And because Al-Qaeda really brought a lot of novel innovations to understanding how war, like how to distinguish, right? These people weren't formal soldiers of the Afghanistan government, right? When they were there, they were some of them had pseudo-military training and had fighting and things. And so it really got very complicated, as we saw, with understanding how the rules of war work, who could be detained, how do we attack these people. And so, yeah, that is a whole novel innovation. But at least for much of, history, right, the goal is to confine war to just legitimate sovereign states. So yeah, it's an important one, right?
Well, I call it the Batman problem, right? Like, one of the reasons why Batman is so controversial is because of vigilantism, right? Like, he works in conjunction with the police chief sometimes, but also kind of takes the law and rule into his own hands. Now, that doesn't say that Batman's not doing good, but the question of, right, like, do you just put up a suit and just start taking justice into your own hands? I am justice. I can do a better Batman impression. I just don't want it to be clipped. So that's that. I mean, I think that's pretty straightforward, right? Like, especially because we want the sovereign nations to be, there needs to be an authority. There needs to be one authority who kind of has exhausted all diplomatic relations and negotiations and peace and alternative, right? And so then the sovereign nation has done that diplomatically, and then this idea that then they can declare war. So that's also part of it. The other is Aquinas says, secondly, a just cause is required, namely that those who are attacked should be attacked because they deserve it on account of some fault. Wherefore Augustine says, a just war is not to be described as one that avenges wrongs, when a nation or a state has to be punished for refusing to make amends for the wrongs inflicted by its subjects, or to restore what is seized unjustly. So this idea that, right, like, the goal of the war needs to be morally permissible, morally outstanding and outright, and not just as the Roman Empire would do, just like, well, we want your land.
Yeah, so you have to have a legitimate thing. And so, going in for the right reasons. Like, I think it's very clear, obviously, if you're attacked, right? And like the Second World War, the United States was attacked by the Empire of Japan. And so that makes it very clear. It's like, oh, you were attacked. You were just sitting there in Hawaii, and they, and you see this in other times in history where, so it's the aggressor is taking an unjust action, and you're allowed to respond to that injustice, right, with force. And I think that's similar to, again, police cadet training. Like, you're only allowed to shoot someone when they're killing someone. Not that they could kill someone, or they might kill someone, or thinking of killing someone. It's no, they have to be actively posing a threat as perceived by the officer. And there's a bunch of Supreme Court case law on this. And so I think it's a similar mentality here. It's confining it to, you have been wronged and you can't now. So now does Aquinas say you can't do it out of vengeance, right? Or he says, so like if they take your territory, you could take it back. Is that permissible, Father? Like, at least in that principle, in that point that Aquinas has.
Such like precepts, as Augustine observes, should always be borne in readiness of mind, so that we be ready to obey them, and if necessary, to refrain from resistance or self-defense. Nevertheless, it is necessary sometimes for a man to act otherwise for the common good, or for the good of those with whom he is fighting. Hence Augustine says, those whom we have to punish with a kindly severity, it is necessary to handle in many ways against their will. For when we are stripping a man of the lawlessness of sin, it is good for him to be vanquished, since nothing is more hopeless than the happiness of sinners, whence arises a guilty impunity and an evil will, like any internal enemy. So I think the idea is, again, this idea of exhaustion. It's not like, I'm going to punch you because you punch me, right? That's Jesus turns the other cheek, of just like, what is now? We've been attacked. Now, what are the ways that we can respond? And is retaliation for the common good? Does it preserve and eradicate evil? Does it preserve good and eradicate evil? Or is there another like diplomatic way that we can do it? And so, the question of like the attack of Japan in World War II, right? We were really trying to stay out of the war. And then this got us into the war, but we didn't just fight with Japan, right? We entered the war in Europe as well. And so that's the question too of the common good and preservation of civilization and fighting against evil, which may seem like kind of hard to pin down, especially when there are so many political debates about what is the common good. But the United States entrance into the war also led to its conclusion with those things. And so I think that's maybe not open to debate, but I think it's a topic that you can very easily like break down even further, and a lot of nuances and everything. But so I think that's what Aquinas is saying, is we don't want it to just be for the reason of self-defense, but that self-defense aggravates a reason for the common good.
Yeah, I think, because in World War II, right, Germany declared war on us after Japan attacked us, and they were allied. And I think that's an interesting angle, because we don't have a lot of formal declarations of war anymore, right? The last time the U.S. declared war was during World War II. So Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Iran now, Afghanistan, right? All these different conflicts, even the first Gulf War, there was not a formal declaration of war by Congress. And that's partially because war is changing, and I think it's getting a lot quicker, and having to go through Congress, you can't always get that done. But also certain international law ramifications, because if you're at a state of war, like all the allies have to kind of draw their lines, is the conventional understanding. And so if you declare war, then all your allies and then the person you've declared war against and all those allies are kind of like lined up against each other. And so that's what happened in World War II, is that there was a formal alliance between Hitler and Germany and Japan. And so I think, and also obviously Germany was committing their own things now. And that's how World War I kind of became a problem, because there were all these secret alliances, right? Serbia attacked, or Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia, and then they killed Franz Ferdinand, and then Russia. So they attacked Serbia in retaliation, and then the Russians got involved because they were allied with Serbia. And then I have to remember all the different alliances. And then Germany backed up Austria-Hungary. And then how did France get involved? Was France allied with somebody? But I think the problem is that the Germans and somehow the French, where I guess France must have been allied with Serbia or Russia, because Germany attacks them. but they go through Belgium, and Belgium was allied with the UK. And so it just became a whole mess. And so you had all these kind of legacy factions fighting each other. And we still have that today, right? There's different lines. There's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which says in the 5th article of their agreement that an attack on one is considered an attack against all. So if you attack Turkey, which is a member of NATO, and they invoke that, they can ask for the assistance of all the other member countries. And so, yeah, but I think it does, because it talks about that. And also, yeah, for the common good, you have to go not just for self-defense, but it's always say like a just wars, you're doing it for the right reasons. It's not just because you can win. It's because you have to have the right goals.
And then this brings up maybe a point, right? That peace is not the absence of war. I think many people misconstrue, right, peace as being the absence of conflict, but peace is a fruit of the Holy Spirit. And that Jesus was most at peace and most happy and most fulfilled when he was on the cross. And so, which was not the absence of conflict at all. It was the height of human conflict, right? Like betrayal, loneliness, physical, brutal torture, murder, execution. But this interior peace, right? While the storms are raging on outside, right? The calm beneath the waves. And so that's the idea of like, how do we preserve peace through war, right? Or peace through strength, is this idea that we're not trying to avoid conflicts, we're trying to avoid evil. And war is not intrinsically evil, but it can become evil, right? So that idea that like, is war morally neutral? Well, it depends, right? There are just wars and there are unjust wars. And so that's why it's so important to have these categories in place, to know them, to understand them, because we're not just like, whenever a politician or anyone promises like a utopia, that's not what we're trying to create. That's not what Catholics don't want. Heaven on earth, right? Heaven and earth meet so that we can get to heaven. That's this idea. So like this, we cannot have this utopia vision of earth. And whenever anyone tries to comment that, or promise that they can do this, right, that's always a follow almost a red flag. Just philosophically, it's almost near impossible too, right? Because as long as we live in a fallen world, it's not going to happen. So the third principle, go for it, Charles, why not?
But yes, no, I think the intrinsically evil, I think, because at least in this context, we're meaning that intrinsically evil is never permissible, right? And so we can't say war is bad, right? Like, but it's not intrinsically evil. And the same way that, like, you can fight a war for the right reasons. It's not a desirable thing, maybe, right? And this is where good and bad, intrinsic, evil, and everything, like, there's words mean many different things in many different contexts. But I think it's important. When we say it's not intrinsically evil, it doesn't mean like, like war is the preferable option. I think that's obviously what this whole, prelude has been. And peace through strength was coined by President Reagan, who in his Time for Choosing speech, which is actually really good. It was kind of one of his ways that he really hit the national stage in 1964. He said, "There is no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there is only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender." And it was sort of like the appeasement model. He was talking about the Soviet Union at the time, but there was obviously the appeasement movement after World War I when it came to Hitler in Germany, that like, just try to keep them happy, just keep them at bay, and give a little here, and just, we don't want war, and we don't want war, but at the same time there's a duty to, like, there's the Roman proverb, right? If you want peace, prepare for war. Like, you have to have the ability to back up your words, and to, if there is an aggression, right, you can respond in an acceptable way and responsible way and an effective way. I remember in college, there were some friends of mine who were in the Air Force ROTC, and I made a joke with them, and I said, like, you guys are the last line of defense. Like, we only call you when everything gets really bad. Like I said, you're just preparing. It's like, spending all your time focusing on the lifeboat and not the cruise ship. I was poking fun at them. I, of course, have great respect for our armed forces. And he came back with actually a snarky comment that's actually resonated with me. And he said, "No, we're the first line of defense." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Why do you think people come to the negotiating table? Because they know that the U.S. has a very powerful military. So in some ways, having the right tools and capability and training you can prevent war, because like nuclear war, it's sort of and Reagan was into this. He didn't really like nuclear weapons, but his preference was that nobody had nuclear weapons. But he said if there are nuclear weapons, we should have some. And he did work a lot towards disarmament at the Soviet Union, and there was obviously a lot we can go in there. But realizing war is an option does help make negotiation easier, because you don't want to get to war. It's like a lawsuit, right? Like no one wants to go to court, right? Settle with, beforehand, because at least you know what your outcome is. A case can go either way. In war, same way, right? Like there have been people that have lost wars who were the right people to have won the war, but they didn't have the tools and the mechanisms to do it. And so, yeah, it's a good point, Farlamers, but thanks for letting me go on a little tirade and quoting A Time for Choosing. So, but yes, the next principle.
The next principle from Aquinas says that it is necessary that the belligerents should have a rightful intention, so that they intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. Hence, Augustine says, true religion looks upon as peaceful those wars that are waged not for motives of aggrandizement or cruelty, but the object of securing peace, of punishing evildoers, and of uplifting the good. For it may happen that the war is declared by the legitimate authority and for a just cause, and yet be rendered unlawful through a wicked intention. Hence, Augustine says, the passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an unpacific and relentless spirit, the fervor of revolt, the lust of power, and such things, all these are rightly condemned in war. So this kind of bridges what we were just talking about, right? That the intention has to be also be justified, right? That
it's not they poked me, I'm going to kill them because I hate them, right? It's more of they poked me, right? I can respond because I want to make sure that there's a just and equitable outcome to this. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just because an act of war is committed against you doesn't give you carte blanche to just, get all your bad emotions out on people, but to rather be strategic and if your goal is why are you fighting the war, it's to not have the war end, right? Not to just, to subjugate, not out of conquest, but out of trying to get a lasting peace.
Yeah. And this seems to me where the principle of proportionality comes in, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, and so that Aquinas, and he quotes largely from Augustine. So it's an Augustinian tradition that Aquinas answers with maybe a little bit more nuance or maybe more clarity, or kind of just more systematically, as he's the
systematized.
Systemic theology is just the study of systems, but just like a very organized way of thinking, right? And so for Aquinas, those three principles had to be present, right? So it's declared by the proper authority that a just cause is required, namely those who are attacked, and then that the end, the rightful intention, right? So it's the means and the ends, and by the proper authority. So Aquinas is kind of sitting pretty with just war theory for a long time. The only main addition to it is then the next, probably the Council of Trent in 1566, and they add in their section on the fifth commandment, the killing of a man by public authority is not murder, but a lawful act of justice. Those who bear the sword wield it as ministers of God. So that's a bold statement.
Some context around that, Father?
From Trent. That's a quote I'm reading here. Here we go. Again, this prohibition does not apply to the civil magistrate, to whom is entrusted power of life and death, by the legal and judicious exercise of which he punishes the guilty and protects the innocent. The use of the civil sword, when wielded by the hand of justice, far from involving the crime of murder, is an act of paramount obedience to this commandment, which prohibits murder. The end of the commandment is the preservation and security of human life, and to the attainment of the end of this end, the punishments inflicted by the civil magistrate, who is the legitimate avenger of crime, naturally tend, giving security to life by repressing outrage and violence. Hence these words of David, "In the morning I put to death all the wicked of the land, and I might cut off all the workers of iniquity from the city of the Lord. In like manner, the soldier is guiltless, who, actuated not by motives of ambition or cruelty, but by a pure desire of serving the interests of his country, takes away the life of an enemy in a just war. They are on record instances of carnage executed by the special command of God himself. The sons of Levi, who had put to death so many thousands in one day, were guilty of no sin. When the slaughter had ceased, they were addressed by Moses in these words: "You have consecrated your hands this day to the Lord." This is different than saying God ordains a war, right? Like God wants this. This is the will, Deus Vult, right? This is the will of God. But, right, I think that's the very important line, right? The soldier is guiltless, who, actuated not by motives of ambition or cruelty, but by pure desire of serving the interests of his country, takes away the life of an enemy in a just war, right? So you get soldiers who go AWOL, right? Kind of go on their own thing. But then this is also a question, veterans who come back from Iraq, Afghanistan, right? The big question to themselves is, why was I fighting this war? And the same thing in like World War I, World War II. This is why it's so important to care for our vets, because they're sacrificing their life. They're making the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. And then to put them in that situation for an unjust reason or in an unjust place causes not only physical harm of those, but the mental, emotional, and spiritual harm of those soldiers. Their souls are being entrusted to the proper authority. And so that question of, like, why was I fighting is something that, it shouldn't be taken lightly, because it's about the soul of the soldier, right? This is why we were just following orders is not a proper defense.
Yeah. So no, it's a good point. And I think, we saw a lot of that at Nuremberg, to quote the recent movie, where people were saying, I was just following orders. They just told me to do that. Like, I thought it was bad. Well, you think it's bad now that you've lost the war, right? You weren't really sticking up for it. Like I remember, it's really challenging because obviously there's a need for military efficiency and discipline. And I remember asking a general who lives here in Northern Virginia, retired, and he talked about how that there's so much, like he said, like questioning orders is challenging because like if you're a general, you don't want your soldiers questioning orders. But and so he kind of threaded it. He said, generals, you have a duty to question orders that don't make sense. Like you're entrusted to care for your troops who are trained and disciplined, who may not have all the facts, who may not know all the reasons, because there's a lot of things that go into a state of war. But that as a general, as a leader at the Pentagon, the Defense Department, it's your expectation that if something doesn't make sense, to question it. And there's process actually within the Pentagon on just this point, Father. Like if you think it's unjust, if they say like, go kill all the school children, you're like, oh, well, I don't think I want to do that. You can legitimately, there's certain processes where you can appeal and ask for, and a lot of the things are vetted by military lawyers who look at what U.S. policies allow, international law that we've agreed to. And so there's mechanisms in place. But I think a lot of countries don't have things like that. It's sort of expected blind obedience, or you're shot. Like there's this I always think of like it's how terrible desertion is, right, on all accounts. Like the people who are so despaired that they have to leave their unit, and then when they're caught in World War I, they're shot, right? Like it's just and obviously so you want to make sure. And I think it also recognizes the great moral imperative of leaders, right, at the highest levels of a government, heads of state and heads of government, that you're putting people in situations. It's not it's a very big responsibility. I think we can easily think, oh, isn't it fun? Like I was thinking about this the other day, like because people take oaths of office, right? Like it's in the Constitution for certain members of Congress and for the president and others. But there's also like lower level figures take oaths, and it's frequently a photo op you see in the Oval Office or somewhere, right? That like, the deputy undersecretary of water, gets sworn in. And it's nice and it's a picture opportunity, but it's also a very sacred thing. And not to, just think, oh, the oath you're taking, like if you have responsibility for others, and the invitation of Christ, it talks about this is like, be like, if you, responsibility is responsibility. It's not, I don't rise to be better than others or for that, but recognizing that you have, people under your authority, that you're responsible for, their souls and their care and their behavior. So it is, a sacred thing, and how to recognize how that all goes. But yeah, it can be tricky. So what's the next one, Father?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say too, right? Like this understanding, right, of just authority and the preservation of the common good. There is this level of responsibility, but also, right, like I made a promise of obedience twice at my or diaconate ordination in my ordination to the priesthood, right? I promised respect and obedience to my bishop and his successors. And I think obedience is misunderstood by a lot of priests and also misunderstood by a lot of laity. The bishop cannot ask me to do anything immoral. If he did, my responsibility is to say no, right? But on the flip side, if the bishop does ask me to do something and there's no legitimate reason to not do that, then I have to obey, trusting that the bishop has prayed, that this is doing the will of the Father. And if it's something that I don't want to do, right, being obedient is a virtue, as long as it's moral and there's no conviction against conscience. And so that is also something you have to weigh, right? When following orders, the orders have to be moral, they have to be legitimate, and they can't just be like willy-nilly, I think, as the phrase goes. So then let's talk about what our catechism says. Obviously, the Council of Trent, our catechism of the Council of Trent is our catechism. It's important to know and understand there have only ever been 2 catechisms published in the history of the church, both after major councils. The Council of Trent published a catechism, and then, of course, after the Second Vatican Council, they published the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And fun fact, I believe I'm correct in this, we are the only religion to fully publish what we believe in a book such like the Catechism. I'm trying to nuance it a little bit so that it's true. But anywho, Catechism 2309, for those who are reading along at home, we have 4 principles that are outlined in the just war paragraph. 1, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain.
Wait, I'm trying to understand that. Wait, so this is what makes a war just, is like these things have to all be true?
Right. So if you are inflicted.
Oh, these are legitimate uses for military force. Yes.
The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or communities of nation must be lasting, grave, and certain. As in, like, you can't just like enter into a conflict for.
Interesting, lasting. Because, I think of last summer in June when the U.S. bombed the nuclear sites, right, which was a very surgical mission. I guess the damage was lasting because we pretty much decimated it, but it's not ongoing hostilities, right? And I think that's maybe the distinction there. It's not the
100 Years War.
Yeah. Which, how long was it? 100 years. And there's the 30 Years War. They should have better names back then. Were they fighting? How long is this war going to take? 100 years. Get ready, guys.
Well, that's the joke. Why do they name it World War I? Kind of setting up World War II.
Yes. But it must be lasting, grave. So the damage inflicted has to be lasting. So it's not necessarily that the hostilities are lasting, but that it's lasting, grave, severe, right, and certain. So I guess certain is that it was caused, right? There's murkiness.
You know what happened. You know who did it. You know, it's clear that this is an act of war. That's how I understand it. I would like to offer the disclaimer, 3/4 of the way through this episode. I am not a moral theologian, barely a theologian, but I did say at a Holiday Inn last night. The second one is all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. This is this is where I think the majority of the debate rests on have all the other options been exhausted. And the problem is we don't know what the options are. We don't know what could have been. We don't know what would have worked. We don't know what gives away your hand. Impractical, right? So that's like, I think it's kind of a subjective word.
Yeah. Well, I think impractical would be like, yeah, if you're literally attacked, you like if you at Pearl Harbor, were we allowed to shoot back at the Japanese planes? Like, well, maybe we should try calling up the ambassador. It's like they're attacking you. It's impractical right now to call the ambassador and say, please stop. Right. So I think at least to me that was, or maybe they're not engaging in diplomatic efforts, right? They attack you and then they stop talking and you're like, okay, well, I can't have any diplomatic efforts, or ineffective. And I think, yeah, it is a slippery slope because like, I mean, I guess if you both sides say, all right, let's just agree to disagree. Now we're going to go fight. Like, that's very clear. Like, okay, diplomatic efforts have failed, but usually it doesn't quite get to that. Like, oh, things aren't working. Then I think that's where you get ultimatums, right? Which is a fun word, which I originally associated with Jason Bourne until I learned more about what that means. But yeah, and ultimately, so you pursue the diplomatic effort, and I think that's something that the church is really big into, right? I remember hearing the U.S. has the most diplomatic relations of any country in the world, meaning we have diplomatic relations, ambassador level relations, or consular relations with more countries than any other country in the world. But know who number 2 is? The Vatican, and that's actually because a lot of the modern diplomatic apparatus was invented by the Holy See, because the Holy See would send legates and representatives to the monarchies and kingdoms and sovereign republics and grand duchies of Europe, and a lot of that built on it. And actually, in one of the 19th century Vienna conventions, there's what's called the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps. So it's the most senior diplomat of all the ambassadors accredited to a nation. So in the US, right, we have a bunch of embassies in DC from all around the world. And the most senior diplomat who's had been the ambassador to the US from their country the longest is considered the dean, or the doyen. It's like there's a French way of saying it, but dean, we'll use the English, dean of the diplomatic cardinals. Not diplomatic cardinals, dean of the diplomatic corps. But there's also a carve out, and it says, however, countries may make the papal nuncio their diplomatic dean, even if he's not the longest serving ambassador, which is interesting. And I was like, oh, it's a fun little perk. But yeah, because you used to be that like the Pope would send a nuncio, monarchies would send ambassadors, and then republics would send ministers. So if you look at old diplomatic correspondence, the U.S. would send, that was the minister of the United States to Great Britain. We didn't send it because ambassador was too monarchical. But then it got complicated because like there were different ranks. Like you always had the emperor and the papacy at the top, and then you had like kingdoms, and then you had grand duchies, and then principalities. Like there's all these nuances. And so one of the great pieces, I mean, the evolution of diplomatic law, like looking at Peace of Westphalia and all these things, is that all sovereign states are given sort of an equal footing. And that really comes into 19th century. And so that's why we call them ambassadors now, because it no longer has a monarchical tone. But was that a significant side trip down?
That was very exciting. And no, I was actually very interesting. I know I sound insincere when I compliment you, but that's just, it gets hard to admit that you're smart sometimes. Number 3, there must be serious prospects of success. So, which in order to have serious prospects of success, you have to have clear outlined goals, right? Like measurable, quantifiable, smart goals.
Smart goals.
Right. Otherwise, it's like, how do we know this is a success? Well, if they stopped throwing rocks at us. That's not a great goal. But yeah. And then again, with maybe like peace and evil sounds like ephemeral topics, but I think they can be very clearly defined. I mean, especially by the church, we know what evil is. We know what dignity and respect of the human person is. And so to restore that, this is the problem maybe in modern warfare of this idea of regime changes that is popular and happening. Sometimes it creates a vacuum. And like this idea of like, well, now what is the responsibility of the United States and other governments to stay and build back this kind of government, right? Is that's the question that can only kind of be answered maybe in hindsight, right? Was this a successful mission, right? Like we eliminated the evil and took out the government that was doing heinous things, not only to the world but to its own population. And so that idea is like, this can only be looked back in hindsight, but the serious prospects, right? Like it has to be like, this isn't an impossible mission. This isn't mission impossible. But that like we can win, that we can accomplish this, we can achieve this, and without any major unforeseen circumstance.
That's a good point. Yeah. So the serious prospects, I think, is an important one because you don't really know the success, right? But it's like it's legitimate that you're going to be successful in your endeavor. It does make me kind of wonder though, like if you're the like Spartans, the last 300 of them, right? Like fighting to the death, like there's no odds for success. Like, do you just give up at that point when there's overwhelming force? Or like, yeah, when you see, Germany invading Poland, and I think I've seen clips where like people were on horseback, like trying to fight back, because they still had their World War I weapons. And of course, Germany had rearmed when they weren't supposed to under the Peace of World War I agreement. So that one, that one's always kind of been tricky because I think I get your point on the motivations, right? Is that you're trying to be successful, but does that mean that like if you're outnumbered and outgunned, you don't have, as a country, you don't have a legitimate recourse? Do you think, or how would you wrestle that?
Well, I think there's a nuance there that we kind of maybe touched upon earlier, but maybe need to do more so of like, when Germany is invading you, right? It's not like we're not declaring war, we're defending human life and defending ourselves, right? And so in the act of the moment, right, it's not a declaration of war, a thought out process, right? We're being attacked. And so there's a natural inclination, right? The natural law takes over in the sense of, right, like I'm going to do good and avoid evil, but I'm also going to preserve my life and the life of others. So I think it's not a matter of like, I think it's like, okay, we're going to go to war and we have a chance to think this out and enter into this, like, is this something that we can win, rather than we've just been invaded and there's nothing we could do about it. It's like, oh no, you got to defend freedom, right? Pope Benedict XVI said freedom has to be constantly won over in every generation. And that doesn't just mean war, right? It means at the polls, politically, ideologically, all that stuff, spiritually. But yeah, so I think there's a nuance there that maybe it's not so clear, right? But like when you're declaring war, going to war, or looking at a situation that needs an intervention.
Yeah. But also you could look at is like, there was a legitimate chance of success is you're being outgunned, of like damaging your enemy's ability to continue, perhaps, right? Like I'm trying to understand like what situations would clearly qualify out of bounds, but like if you're being outgunned and outnumbered, right, at least you're trying to do something, right? Like, so there are individual successes, you're taking out the aggressor in individuals or a subset. But to me, that's always been a tricky one, right? Because I think, and maybe part of it is just our culture, we do kind of glorify like being the last man standing, like, Custer's last stand. But that is a good point. Like Custer's last stand, like he should have not gone into that situation. There were a lot of things, and we don't have to go through the Battle of Little Bighorn right now. But yeah, you don't. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a difference between battle and war, right? Like, I think that's a good distinction to make, right? Like if you're in a battle, it's like, maybe we shouldn't have, maybe I shouldn't be in this battle, but also maybe we didn't start it, right? Like again, I think there's that nuance and that wiggle room for this idea of like we were attacked, right? Like we're being blitzkrieged, and so like are we just not going to shoot at the planes because we can't see them, and just take the bombing? Like I don't know, logically that doesn't make sense to me. And also I think like this idea of like mutual combat, right? Like there are the agreement of when two countries like, okay, we're at war, now there's this sense of mutual combat. But when there's not mutual combat, right, like I'm just going to attack you, I think you have a right to defend your life, to preserve your life, right? Again, the self-defense has always been a moral principle too, not the goal, right? Like not like, okay, you're being attacked, you have to kill this person, but like it can be seen as justifiable.
Yeah, well,
because it's not premeditated.
Yeah, and it may be like thinking about it more of if you're coming into like a war of choice, right? Not war of choice, it's not a great word, but if you're looking at a situation and you're like, well, we can, send in. I mean, yeah, it's a tricky one because like, do you just like an invasion of Japan, right? They forecast that there'd be 1 million casualties on the Allied forces to invade Japan in World War II, and now again, it's kind of gets like anxious by it means like, okay, serious prospect that would work, but if it was like, oh, it's 1 million and like there's no chance that they're going to work. Like, well, you don't want to send people in that way. But yeah, the self-defense, I think that's a good way to nuance it, Father, like to inform by other parts of Christian doctrine that, okay, yeah, if you're being attacked and you're being invaded, you can respond, even if it's unlikely that, you're going to succeed. However, if you're engaging in an offensive capability, right, to defend yourself or to defend the rights of others, you have to make sure that you're going in with a serious prospect of success, not like, we'll just see what happens. Throw in 1 million people, right, and roll the dice. Even then, that's I would say an unserious prospect of success. But if you go in with no prospect of success to engage in an active thing, it is tricky. And maybe that means also you have to find out how do we make it where it does have a prospect of success. Because like with Japan, and that's what the Truman was debating, right, with the bomb and everything, is he was like, he was comparing these different options. And so if you have different options, take the one that has the best chance of success, which is common sense now to take that, right?
Well, yeah. And again, it leads to the debate of like, what is success, right? Like, but also like this can't be a principle considered in isolation, right? Like the best prospect for success may not be the most morally justifiable, right? This is the debate with the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons now, right? The most successful thing of wiping out evil could be dropping a nuclear bomb or an atomic bomb, right? But is that the most morally, because it's indiscriminate killing, right? There's no sense of that stuff. So there is.
Well, if it is indiscriminate, I can justify nuclear war if you need me to, Father. So
maybe not on the record here.
We'll do an episode on the bomb because I got some ideas on how to wrestle with that a little bit more. But
well, yeah. Anywho, so going on to the next one, we've exhausted this one maybe to the point of my interest. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. So the point I was making,
yes, is yeah,
it has. This is proportionality.
Yeah, and proportionality is an interesting one too, because this is another one, and maybe I'm just too practical on how some of these things work. All right, like an insurgent force, with a speedboat tries to blow up an American battleship, right? And we can figure out, all right, it came from this, country of X, and we know it came from them. They blew up our ship, right? It was a speedboat with some small explosives. Can we invade the country, right? Can we topple their government? Or do we just have to send speedboats back with, explosives to talk? Like, that's where I think the proportionality is important to recognize. Like now, they blew up our speedboat. Now we're going to kill every man, woman, and child in the entire country and drop atomic bombs everywhere. That might not be I think we can clearly say it would be out of bounds. But the idea that, we were attacked by a legitimate force, they committed just an act of war against us. Therefore, all their military assets are fair game, right? And like, how would you wrestle with that, Father? I'm just like, could we start blowing up all their ships, or do we have to stick it like, they've only gone this far, we can't go any further?
I would err on the side of there has to be a limit. Otherwise, I think was this the example this summer? I may be misremembering it. That after we bombed some nuclear facilities, then one of our military bases in the Middle East was bombed, but we were warned about it and told about it, and so like it was like yeah, but like there was this idea of like we should anticipate, like retaliation I think should always be anticipated, and right, so the level of retaliation that like, okay, it makes sense, like we shouldn't be surprised that now one of our military bases is going to be attacked, and we did everything and we could to mitigate the damage, like the loss of human life, which I think is important. But yeah, there has to be a limit. It's hard, right? Because one third is proportionate to 33 out of 100, right? But those are bigger numbers. So like that sense of proportionality, but it's like, and the idea of like one for one. Well, okay, you took 10 hostages. Now we're going to take 10 hostages. Right. Again, I think that can even be nuanced into like a moral dilemma and situation. Maybe it's proportionality. Maybe do they mean like a one for one thing? Again, this is the thing with the bomb, right? Is like, I think this is where the argument rests, or a lot of people go to this is like, how is that proportionate to any act? This argument that is made. I don't want to get you going off, but so I think that has to be again, the responsibility for this is the sovereign leaders and the generals and the people who are in charge. Right? The responsibility rests on their soldiers' shoulders to make sure that their soldiers are carrying out acts that are proportionate, that are just, that are morally good and outweigh certain things. And so, yeah, like that, all those options have to be exhausted. They have to be thought about. They have to be discussed, right? Like, and again,
I think the goal should be to use the least amount of force necessary to achieve your objectives. I'm more comfortable with like thinking of it that way, right? At least kind of on the surface level, that like, okay, like if our goal is to, our regime attacks a speedboat, hits the USS Cole, right? This little boat came up and blew a hole and it killed soldiers or sailors. Now a legitimate response is probably not nuclear war, right? We have a lot of nuclear weapons. We could probably achieve success, but that would not, we've destroyed our enemy, but we could have achieved our enemy with a lesser amount of force. And maybe that's a better way to think about it, right? Like, it is on the continuum. Because, if someone's shooting at you with, AK-47s, it doesn't mean you can only shoot back with, rifles. You can order an airstrike, right, on their location. And if you're able to take it with, and like, to me, that would be okay, right? Wouldn't it be fine to call an airstrike on people shooting at you? Or do you have to wait until they get planes and then you can have the planes fight the other planes?
No, I don't think that's, I don't think that's impermissible. I'm thinking too, I live in Ridgefield, and it's the home of the Battle of Ridgefield, a Revolutionary War battle where it was considered United States a colony loss. The British came in through the Long Island Sound, landed in Westport, and marched all the way up to Danbury to blow up an armory that the colonies had. And then the colonists pushed them back to Ridgefield, where they had the Battle of Ridgefield. There are actually British soldiers buried in the center of town. I always bless their graves when I drive by. And then they were able to push them back to the Sound. And so I think like that idea of like resources, like destroying resources, like I think militarily that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, okay, they're attacking us. Let's destroy their weapons systems, their armory, their holds, right? So like, okay, maybe blowing up a dock, right? You can destroy resources without the cost of human life, right? But this is also a conversation that was happening with Israel, Gaza, Palestine, and everything, right? Like the morality of the blockade, right? And not allowing resources and medical aid to the victims of in the Gaza Strip, right, in the West Bank, right? Like we can attack and we can justify, but we can't deny humanitarian aid and resources. And so this idea, and then that was the debate too, is like, okay, they're trying to destroy strategic buildings, but then they're placing civilians in those buildings, and there were warnings and everything. And so this is, I'm not, it's a super controversial topic and I don't have all the information, but like, that's why it's so hotly debated, and rightly so. I think, again, it should be something that is questioned and thought about because it has such great consequences. But yeah, I think that idea of proportionality too is like maybe not one for one human life, but like the effect. Like, okay, you blew up one of our ships, we're going to destroy your ship.
Yeah. Well, again, I would say if you blow up one of our ships, we're going to destroy your navy, but
that would not be proportional. So then the catechism concludes that.
Why would?
What do you want?
Wait, you can't just end on that would not be proportional. No, because that's the whole. We can only blow up one ship if they blow up one ship. No, I'm
saying that would be like the first thought, not just like, okay, let's obliterate obliterate everything that they've ever made.
So, and I not, but I can see, to me, military infrastructure is compartmentalized, right? Like, yeah, military. If you commit a war against us, the military infrastructure, I would think, is all fair game, right? Any assets you have that are militaristic can now be destroyed because you have committed an act of war. Now, yes, I think civilian infrastructure that has military components. So an army is different, but like in World War II, we bombed, railroad tracks and factories that supported the German war effort and the Japanese war efforts. But again, we're not just blowing up where they make, cars that civilians drive. We're blowing up where they make tanks, where they make bombers, or where they make the equipment that a fair amount can support those things. So, and that's a thing that did come up because some people said you can't target civilian infrastructure at all. And actually, international law says you can destroy civilian infrastructure if it's being used for militaristic purposes, right? And so, if there's a power plant that does supports a neighborhood and a military base, you can destroy that, right? In a reasonable way. But you can't just say, oh, this power plant doesn't support any military. It's just a hospital and like an orphanage and a bunch of, puppies. Like, well, don't blow up that. And so that's where it is. But I think you should, yeah. The proportionality, I find this one to be tricky to wrestle with and to understand. Because if it just means, kind of tit for tat, then it does limit a lot what you can do, because they shot one of our guys, we can shoot one of their guys. They blew up one of our ships, we can blow up one of their ships. Like, I don't think we want to go that route, right? Because otherwise,
right, it has to be lasting, grave, and certain. So they can't be talked about in isolation. They have to be thought about together as a cohesive piece and unit. And I think that's why just war is so hotly debated, right? Someone can say this is an unjust war and this is a just war, and you have to look at the reasons for why they're saying that, because it is spelled out very clearly in Catholic doctrine what is just, what is unjust. And I think it's one of our friends talks about, right? Like, it's like interest media, right? It's all headlines, it's all grab kind of stuff. And so it's the trendy thing to say, this is an unjust war. Okay, now give us your reasons why they're not being met. You can't just make a statement and not back it up. So,
because the Catechism concludes, it says the evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. So basically, it's the armchair quarterbacking is not the goal here. Like, if you're in a position of responsibility authority, you have to be thinking about these things and trying to wrestle with them. If you have responsibility for the common good. But also, I want to talk a little bit, because I think it's the first one: damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, or certain. So that means you've been attacked, but also it would be justifiable. For example, when Hitler started invading other countries in Europe, that would have been an admissible time to have gone to war, because he was committing atrocities against other countries. Even though you yourself were not attacked, you may have the moral responsibility, if you can, to support the efforts of those who are, the innocent parties. You can't just say like, oh, figure it out, call us later, right? There's a moral response to respond to those who need help, and if you have the ability to support them. And I think that gets to the United Nations, which has always comes to the United Nations, the responsibility to protect, which is endorsed by the General Assembly, but also Pope Benedict talked about this, which is that it's a global political commitment, which is endorsed by the UN General Assembly, in order to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. And it's a well-established international norm since the early 2000s, but it's got three pillars. The first is protection responsibilities of the state. Each individual state has a responsibility to protect its population from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. So nothing wrong there. International assistance and capacity building. States pledge to assist each other in their protection responsibilities. So you can support efforts of helping other countries. And then third, if any state, or timely and decisive collective response, if any state is manifestly failing in its protection responsibilities, then states should take collective action to protect the population. So if it, Hitler in Nazi Germany, he was killing his own people, right? The 11 million people were killed, 6 million Jews. That even if he didn't invade another country, you would have, under this precept, the ability to go in and, topple that regime because it was committing grave abuses, obviously trying to pursue a diplomatic means and other measures, right? But at the end of the day, right, if someone's committing that, and I think that's where it talks about the community of nations and the Catechism. And again, Pope Benedict and John Paul talked a lot about this in light of their experience in World War II. Because it's not just hey, you can do whatever you want in your borders, but once it impacts me, then I'm going to get involved. You can, stop people who are committing evil atrocities even against their own populations. And that's international law allows for that. You don't disagree? Want to go fisticuffs?
Sounds good.
We should go to war.
Actually, Charles. No, I think it makes sense, right? Because in the same way, like we have the response to stand up to a bully in school, right? Nations have this responsibility. I think it lends to a debate of like America's interventionist policies in the 20th century, or then isolationist policies, and I think both of those policies can lend towards an extreme, right? Like, do we have to be the police of the world? Maybe not, but do we have a responsibility to protect citizens of other countries when they're being destroyed, killed, murdered, tortured, treated unjustly by their government? Yeah. So I think in summary, there's a lot of nuance here, and read what the church teaches. Read articles from trustworthy sources who are giving you the information, all the information that they have. Don't just fall into political lines. There are times where the church is apolitical, right? We transcend politics. And so because that's how we can be a moral authority, right? Where interest is, Paul VI says, right, we're experts in humanity, and our interest is in preserving the dignity of. So, but like, don't just fall into an ideology because it's what your particular political party thinks, right? But look at all the facts that are available to us. Look at the church. Trust those who are smarter than us, right? Don't take Charles and I's word for it. I think a lot of this conversation was us kind of trying to wrestle with our own understanding of things and our own lack of expertise in these things as well, and to just motivate to keep doing research, keep understanding, pray for peace, pray for justice, work towards that in our own lives, and to kind of just, nuance, I think, is something that has been lost, but we want to regain nuance, right? So Aquinas says always make distinctions, right? One word used in different contexts can mean different things, especially in something like this as important as the interests of human life.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. Yeah, and to keep the ideals in your mind, right, of what you can, achieve and try to work towards. And yeah, but look at the facts and be aware that there's new. Yeah, I mean, I remember Bishop Barron. He said there's probably never been a war that's been entirely just. And what does he mean by that? He means the church has a very high standard, which it should, and good. And I think that's what the point of this is, right? Like, was it John Paul said, the church at its best doesn't impose, but propose, right? And say, hey, here's the best way to handle this situation is to do X, Y, and Z. And this is the best way to live your life is if you adhere to the teachings of the church. But also a recognition, back to Barron's comment, that, okay, well, there's murkiness in a lot of wars and motivations, right? Was it natural resources? Was it truly moral to protect civilians? Did you convince them to attack you by doing something? But also, and Barron talks about this, even wars that were very just in motivation, such as World War II, right? Where clearly, the Axis powers were doing terrible things to their own people, to their neighbors, to other countries. Even then, there's things that happened in the war that were not good, right? But during World War II, there was a lot of challenges with executing the war always justly, because you have soldiers, some who took the law into their own hands. They had a gun, they had POWs, they shot them, right? And so you see that in Saving Private Ryan, right? Or is it Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, where like I
think it's Band of Brothers.
Yeah, where they the Americans, kill some German POWs who had surrendered and were under the protections that Geneva Convention orders. But yeah, and don't get me wrong, the Nazis did terrible things. I'm not trying to justify that, like, oh, it's kind of equal. Like, no, the Nazis did terrible things. They killed their own people. They killed POWs. If you've seen The Great Escape, right, there's that famous where they, killed. And there's so every war is
one evil does not justify us responding in evil in response.
Exactly. And so keeping those ideals, but recognizing, that there's not really been a perfectly just war. In the same way, there's not been all of us are fallen and sinful and have mistakes and issues, but we should still be working towards that ideal. And and so the church gives us a lot of things to think about here. And I think, it's important to hold public figures accountable. But it's also important to, make sure that your judgment is informed by facts and situations and proper principles, and not just a gut reaction. Oh, something happened that I like or I don't like, right? But to really wrestle with it and give it its due. But it's not easy, right? War, what is it good for?
I was thinking that the whole entire time, and I'm so mad you slipped it in there, and before me.
So, yes.
But as always, like, subscribe, leave us a review. Tell us what you think of us, only if it's a good review. And until next week, work hard and pray harder.